Well, hey, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you for being with me. Today we are in 1 Chronicles chapter 10. I hope you had a great weekend, great time worshiping the Lord Sunday. If for any reason you were not able to worship with us, go to our website, fbcrockhill.org, and watch one of the live streams from this past Sunday. Again, I want to thank all of you who prayed for me during the revival at my home church in Kentucky. And I also want to ask you to do something. Will you pray that your D group multiplies this year? Sometime in the next 2-3 months, will you pray that your D group multiplies? Because our purpose is to make disciples who make disciples. And how do you make disciples? It means you have to pass it on. That's multiplying. If we are not multiplying, if we are not duplicating ourselves, we are not making disciples. We're just doing Bible study. And Bible study is a tool for our growth and multiplication. It's not the end of itself. It is the tool that points toward a higher purpose, making disciples who make disciples, so that it keeps multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. That's what discipleship, that's what disciple makers do. That's what the D groups do, multiply. A D group that stays together year after year is not multiplying, it's not making disciples, and has lost sight of its real purpose. So will you pray that your group multiplies? Some groups are able to multiply after 12 months. Some take 18 months. Occasionally, a group will take 2 years. There's no reason for any group to go more than that without multiplying. All right. Now that I've done that little D group sermon, 1 Chronicles chapter 10, you will discover that over the next 3 weeks, our Bible reading plan is different than we typically do. Normally, we are reading chapters sequentially. All right, we'll start at Mark chapter 1 and go for several chapters, and you see how all of that flows. For the next 3 weeks, it's going to be different. We're going to be jumping all around in the Old Testament, Chronicles, Kings, Samuel. And some of you are looking at that and you're wondering, what in the world is Pastor Steve doing? What's going on? Well, I want to assure you there is a method to the madness. There's a purpose to this. Because I believe when we finish these 3 weeks, you are going to perhaps better understand from a high-level perspective the history of Israel and why things happened the way they did. Not only what happened, but why they happened the way they did. And I think this will give you a new perspective on the Old Testament, and some of this will help you better understand some of the other Old Testament books or prophets when you're reading them. So trust me, stay with me. I think at the end, this will be a real benefit to you. Now, we're starting in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, which is the record of Saul, King Saul, Israel's first king, of his death. So the death of the first king of the nation of Israel and his 3 sons, including Jonathan. So let's read that starting at verse 1. 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1. He says, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain at Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and his 2 brothers, the sons of Saul." Verse 3. "The battle became heavy against Saul, and the archers, the Philistine archers, overtook him, and he was wounded by the archers." And then in verse 4, Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it. Kill me. Otherwise, these uncircumcised, the Philistines, will come and abuse my body." But his armor bearer wouldn't kill Saul the king, for he was greatly afraid. You don't touch the king. You don't touch the anointed one. Therefore, Saul took his sword and fell on it, committed suicide, so he could not be alive and abused. It's a tragic ending. A sad story of Saul and his sons dying in battle. And you go on to read in chapter 10, the Philistines would go on to behead Saul's lifeless body and display his head in their temple to their pagan god Dagon. Now, question. Why did God allow Israel to lose this battle so decisively? We're just coming out of reading Habakkuk, where we learned that God was raising up Babylon to conquer Jerusalem and Judah as punishment, as judgment for their sin. That would be, a few centuries down the road, more than 200 years after Saul. Well, here, why did God do that? It was because of Israel's sin, right? So why did God allow Israel to lose this battle and Saul to die and be beheaded and his head displayed in a pagan temple? Well, look at what he says here in chapter 10, verses 13 and 14. So King Saul died, why? For his trespass. What is trespass? Trespassing is crossing over the line. It's going over the line God has drawn in the sand. It is a word for sin, a word for disobeying God, a word for doing what God tells you not to do. Saul died for his trespass, which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord, which he did not keep, and because he asked counsel of the medium, making inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Saul was guilty of many sins, of disobeying God, not keeping God's commandments. And just one example of that is when he today it would be like seeking advice from somebody who does the tarot cards, or an astrologer in the sky, or a fortune teller, instead of seeking God. And so God says Saul died because of all these sins, all these times he didn't obey God, didn't keep his word. And verse 14, at the end of the middle of it, therefore God, killed him, King Saul, and turned the kingdom, Saul's kingdom, to David, the son of Jesse. Ripped the kingdom away from Saul and gave it to David. And here God killed Saul. Now the Philistines did it, but God removed his hand of protection. Okay? Remember, we read in the last Psalm last Friday, for David was praying for God to protect him from evil people. Here, God withdrew his hand of protection and allowed the Philistines to kill him, and it was as though God had killed Saul. Why? Because of Saul's sin. Saul and the nation suffered. Now, this story illustrates a pattern you're going to see repeated time and time and time again in the history of the nation of Israel. We saw it when we were reading Habakkuk, okay, up in the 500s, a few centuries after what we just read about here. You're going to see this pattern, this story repeat itself over and over and over. And you cannot and will not understand what the Bible teaches about the nation of Israel if you don't understand this pattern. Then it goes all the way back to the time of Moses, when God, through the prophet Moses, warned the people about their future and what was required of them if they were going to be his people and be protected, and what would happen to them if they did not remain faithful to God. There are lessons, and so we're going to jump around a little bit, and I think you'll get this meta narrative. You'll see this big picture of Israel's history, and all of a sudden some things will start coming together for you. But on one level, lessons for us from this is that we need to listen to God and do what he says. That God's favor and blessing and protection are not automatic and guaranteed no matter what we do. We need to listen to God and do what God says. We need to learn from failures, whether it's our own failures or the failures of others. Learn from our own sins and bad decisions, and learn from the sins and bad decisions of others, especially those who came before us. And do not continue making the same mistakes. Do not continue making the same bad decisions. Do not continue committing the same sins. And do not presume upon the protection of God. Israel has never been guaranteed automatic protection by the Lord. And you will see that as we look through these chapters, going all the way back to the time of Moses. I genuinely believe 3 weeks from now, you will understand the Old Testament account, the history of the nation of God's people called the Jewish people of Israel better because of the way we're going to walk through this. So stay with us. And our goal is, yes, to understand, but just as importantly, to learn lessons that will help us do better. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at 2 Samuel chapter 1. So jumping further back into the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 1. I'll see you then. God bless you, everybody.